I never imagined that coming home early from a covert operation would mean walking into my own house to find my sister hunched over my laptop, classified files spread across the dining room table, and within minutes, a federal tactical team breaking down my front door with weapons drawn. What started as a family betrayal became a fight for my career, my freedom, and ultimately my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The key felt heavier than usual as Lieutenant Commander Maya Reeves turned it in the lock of her townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia. 3 weeks ahead of schedule, she had returned from what was officially designated as a training exercise in Eastern Europe, but was actually a signals intelligence operation that would never appear in any public record. The mission had been scrubbed early due to diplomatic complications that Maya did not fully understand and was not cleared to question. She had been instructed to return home, file her reports through encrypted channels, and await further orders. The unexpected early return should have felt like a gift, extra time to rest before the next deployment, a chance to sleep in her own bed and eat food that did not come from military rations. Instead, as the door swung open, Maya felt her stomach drop with the instinctive recognition that something was profoundly wrong. The alarm system had been disarmed, which was impossible because only she knew the code. The security panel glowed green instead of the red it should have displayed after 2 weeks of her absence. Her hand moved automatically to her hip where her service weapon would have been if she were on duty, finding only empty space. She had locked her personal firearm in the safe upstairs before her deployment, following protocol for extended absences. The living room appeared undisturbed at first glance. The furniture remained in its usual arrangement, her books still lined the shelves in alphabetical order by author. The framed photographs of her Naval Academy graduation and various duty stations stood exactly where she had left them. But Maya had been trained to notice details that others missed, and within seconds she catalogued the subtle wrongness that pervaded the space. The cushions on the sofa had been replaced slightly askew. A stack of mail on the side table had been moved, the envelopes no longer perfectly aligned. Someone had been here, someone who had tried to cover their presence but lacked the training to do so flawlessly. Maya moved through the townhouse with careful deliberation, her body falling into the tactical movement patterns drilled into her through years of training. She checked each room systematically, looking for intruders or signs of ongoing presence. The kitchen was empty but showed evidence of recent use. A coffee mug sat in the sink, still slightly damp. The bathroom upstairs revealed a towel hanging on the rack that Maya had definitely left in the linen closet. Her bedroom appeared untouched, the bed still made with military precision, her civilian clothes still organized in the closet by category and color. The door to her home office stood slightly ajar, and Maya's pulse accelerated as she approached. This room contained nothing classified because she followed security protocols religiously, but it did house her personal laptop, her file cabinets with financial records and personal correspondence, and her desk where she occasionally worked on unclassified administrative tasks. She pushed the door open fully and felt her blood turn to ice. Her younger sister Alexis sat at the desk, Maya's laptop open in front of her, a scattered array of papers spread across the usually immaculate surface. Alexis wore jeans and an oversized sweater, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the computer screen. She looked up as Maya entered, her expression cycling through surprise, guilt, and something that looked disturbingly like defiance. For several seconds neither sister spoke. Maya's mind raced through possible explanations, searching for some innocent reason why Alexis would be in her house, at her computer, going through her files. They had not spoken in nearly 4 months, not since their last argument about Alexis's perpetual financial crises, and her expectation that Maya would always serve as her safety net. Alexis had a key to the townhouse for emergencies, but she absolutely did not have permission to enter when Maya was not present, and she certainly had no authorization to access Maya's personal computer. Alexis broke the silence first, her voice carrying a brittleness that suggested she had been preparing for this confrontation. She told Maya not to freak out, that she could explain everything, that it was not what it looked like. The words came out in a rush, defensive and pleading simultaneously. Maya remained in the doorway, her body blocking the exit, her mind already working through the implications of what she was witnessing. Her laptop was password protected with military-grade encryption, The fact that Alexis had somehow gained access meant either Maya's security had been compromised, or her sister had help from someone with technical expertise. Maya's voice emerged cold and controlled when she finally spoke, asking Alexis how she had gotten into the laptop and what exactly she thought she was doing. Alexis stood up from the chair, her hands raised in a placating gesture that only heightened Maya's anger. She explained that she had hired someone, a tech expert she knew through friends, who had helped her bypass the password protection. She claimed she was looking for financial documents, specifically information about a trust fund their grandmother had established before her death 5 years ago. Alexis insisted that Maya had been hiding information about this trust, that their grandmother had left money to both of them but Maya had kept it all, and she was simply trying to find proof of this theft. The accusation was absurd on multiple levels, and Maya felt anger rising to override her initial shock. There was no hidden trust fund, no secret inheritance, no financial conspiracy. Their grandmother had left a modest amount of money that had been split equally between the two sisters, documented in legal paperwork that both of them had received from the estate attorney. Alexis had burned through her portion within 18 months, spending it on a failed business venture and expensive lifestyle choices, while Maya had invested hers carefully and used a portion for a down payment on this townhouse. Maya told her sister that she was lying, that this had nothing to do with any imaginary trust fund, and demanded to know what Alexis was really looking for. She moved further into the room, close enough now to see the papers spread across the desk. Her blood pressure spiked as she recognized several documents that should not have been on her personal laptop, files she had accidentally downloaded to the wrong device months ago, and had been meaning to delete. They were not highly classified materials, but they were marked as controlled information, requiring proper handling and storage protocols that absolutely did not include leaving them accessible on a personal computer in a civilian residence. Alexis's expression shifted to something calculating, and Maya recognized the look from their childhood. It was the expression her sister wore when she had been caught doing something wrong, and was deciding whether to double down on her lies or pivot to a different manipulation strategy. Alexis said that Maya always acted so superior, so perfect, following all the rules while judging everyone else for being human. She claimed that Maya had built her entire identity around being the responsible one, the military hero, the daughter who never disappointed anyone, while treating Alexis like a perpetual screw-up who could not be trusted with anything important. The psychological attack was familiar territory, and Maya had learned years ago not to take the bait when Alexis tried to transform her own bad behavior into a referendum on Maya's character. She repeated her question with more force, demanding to know what Alexis had been doing on the computer, and whether she had accessed the specific files that Maya could see scattered on the desk. She needed to know the extent of the security breach, needed to understand what information Alexis had viewed, and whether she had copied or transmitted any of it to other parties. Before Alexis could respond, Maya's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a number she did not recognize, but with a Washington area code that suggested official business. She answered with her rank and last name, still keeping her eyes fixed on her sister. The voice on the other end identified himself as Special Agent Carson Briggs from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and he asked if she was currently at her residence in Alexandria. Maya confirmed that she was, her mind already leaping ahead to understand why NCIS would be calling her. Agent Briggs told her to remain exactly where she was, that a team was en route to her location, and that she should not access any electronic devices or attempt to leave the premises. Maya's training prevented her from showing the panic that surged through her nervous system. She responded that she understood and asked what this was regarding. Agent Briggs said only that there had been a security incident involving her credentials, and that they would discuss details when the team arrived. The call disconnected before Maya could ask follow-up questions. She looked at her sister with new comprehension, understanding now that whatever Alexis had done had triggered some kind of alert system, that her intrusion into classified files had been detected by security monitoring, and that federal investigators were now responding to what they would consider a potential breach of national security. Alexis had gone pale, apparently having heard enough of the conversation to understand that the situation had escalated beyond a simple family conflict. She asked what was happening, who was coming, whether Maya had called the police. Maya told her sister to sit down and not touch anything else, that she had created a catastrophic problem that was about to get much worse. She pulled out her phone again, this time calling her commanding officer, Captain Michael Torres, on his personal cell phone. It was Saturday afternoon, and he was likely at home with his family, but this could not wait for business hours. Captain Torres answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the mild irritation of someone interrupted during leisure time. Maya apologized for the weekend call, and then explained as concisely as possible what she had discovered upon returning home early from deployment. She reported that her sister had gained unauthorized access to her personal laptop, that controlled files had been compromised, and that NCIS had already contacted her about a security incident. Her voice remained steady and professional despite the terror coursing through her veins, because falling apart would not help her navigate whatever came next. The silence on the other end of the call stretched long enough that Maya thought the connection might have dropped. When Captain Torres finally spoke, his voice had shifted from irritated to grave. He asked several specific questions about what files had been accessed, whether her sister had any background that would make her a particular security risk, and whether Maya had any reason to believe this was part of a larger intelligence operation, rather than a family member's poor judgment. Maya answered each question honestly, explaining that Alexis had a history of financial problems and poor decision-making, but no political affiliations or foreign contacts that would suggest espionage motives. Captain Torres told Maya that he was going to make some calls, that she should cooperate fully with the NCIS investigation, and that she should expect to be placed on administrative leave pending resolution of the security review. The administrative leave was standard protocol and did not imply guilt, but it meant Maya would be suspended from her duties, stripped of her security clearances, and effectively barred from the work that constituted her entire professional identity. He told her that he believed in her integrity and would support her through the process, but the outcome would depend entirely on what the investigation revealed and whether permanent damage had been done to classified programs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After the call ended, Maya sat down in the chair Alexis had vacated, staring at the scattered papers that represented the detonation of her carefully constructed life. She had spent 15 years building her naval career, had earned her commission through the Naval Academy, had served with distinction in multiple assignments involving signals intelligence and cryptologic operations. She had sacrificed relationships, personal time, and any semblance of normal civilian life in service to her country and her commitment to protecting classified information. And now her sister, through some combination of desperation, stupidity, and selfishness, had potentially destroyed everything Maya had worked to achieve. Alexis was crying now, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her face buried in her hands. She kept saying she was sorry, that she had not meant for this to happen, that she just needed to find information about the trust fund, and did not realize she would trigger any alarms. The excuses sounded hollow because they were hollow. Alexis had known she was doing something wrong when she hired someone to hack into Maya's password-protected computer. She had known she was violating her sister's privacy and trust. She had simply not cared enough about consequences to stop herself, a pattern that had characterized Alexis's entire adult life. Maya felt the familiar weight of responsibility for her younger sister, the burden she had carried since their mother died when Maya was 16 and Alexis was 12. Their father had effectively checked out emotionally after losing his wife, going through the motions of parenting but never really engaging with his daughters' lives. Maya had stepped into the role of caretaker and protector, making sure Alexis ate properly and completed her homework, and had someone attending her school events. She had worked part-time jobs throughout high school to help pay bills and create some financial stability. She had delayed her own dreams to make sure her sister had what she needed. The pattern had continued into adulthood, with Maya bailing Alexis out of financial problems, providing emotional support through failed relationships, offering advice that was rarely taken and assistance that was rarely appreciated. Maya had told herself she was being a good sister, honoring their mother's memory by taking care of family. But she recognized now that her help had been enabling rather than empowering, that she had protected Alexis from consequences in ways that prevented her from learning and growing. And now the final consequence of that enabling had arrived in the form of federal investigators responding to a security breach. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside drew Maya to the window. Two black SUVs with government plates parked in front of her townhouse, and several individuals in tactical gear emerged, moving with the coordinated precision of a rehearsed operation. Maya recognized the equipment and deployment pattern of a federal response team executing a security warrant. They were not taking any chances, treating this as a potentially hostile situation until proven otherwise. Maya turned to her sister and told her to stay calm, to keep her hands visible, and to follow all instructions exactly as given. Alexis looked terrified, which was appropriate given what was about to happen. Maya moved to the front door and opened it before the agents could break it down, raising her hands to show they were empty and calling out her identity and rank. Special Agent Briggs was the first through the door, a man in his 40s with graying hair and the flat expression of someone who had seen every variety of human stupidity and betrayal. He asked Maya to confirm her identity using her military ID, which she retrieved slowly from her wallet with 2 fingers, maintaining visible control of her movements. He examined the ID and then asked who else was in the residence. Maya told him her sister was in the home office upstairs, and that she was unarmed and cooperative. Agent Briggs directed 2 members of his team to secure Alexis while he and the remaining agents conducted a sweep of the townhouse to ensure no additional individuals were present. The next hours passed in a blur of questions, documentation, and the systematic seizure of every electronic device in Maya's home. Her laptop, her phone, her tablet, even her smart television were all confiscated as potential evidence. Agents photographed the scattered papers on her desk, bagged them as evidence, and conducted a thorough search of her entire residence looking for additional classified materials or indications of espionage activity. Maya answered every question truthfully, provided all requested information, and maintained professional composure despite the humiliation of watching strangers rifle through her personal belongings. Alexis was taken into custody, not formally arrested but detained for questioning about how she had accessed the laptop and whether she had acted alone or as part of a larger operation. Maya watched her sister being led out to one of the SUVs, still crying and trying to explain that this was all a misunderstanding. Maya felt a complicated mixture of anger at Alexis for creating this disaster and guilt that she had not somehow prevented it, that she had not better secured her devices or cut off her sister's access to her home after their last argument. As the sun set and the agents finally completed their initial investigation, Special Agent Briggs sat down across from Maya at her dining room table. He explained that the investigation would continue for several weeks at minimum, that her security clearances were suspended effective immediately, and that she should expect to be interviewed multiple times as they worked to understand the full scope of the breach. He said that preliminary analysis suggested this was a case of spectacularly poor judgment by a family member rather than coordinated espionage, but that determination would need to be confirmed through thorough investigation. He also told Maya something that made her blood run cold. The files that Alexis had accessed included information about an ongoing counterintelligence operation targeting foreign attempts to recruit American military personnel, with access to signals intelligence. By accessing and potentially exposing those files, Alexis had compromised operational security and put lives at risk. The investigation would need to determine whether any of that information had been transmitted to third parties, either intentionally or inadvertently, and whether the operation could continue or needed to be shut down. After the agents finally left, taking with them most of Maya's electronic devices and leaving behind business cards and instructions about the investigation process, Maya sat alone in her townhouse and allowed herself to fully feel the magnitude of what had happened. Her career was in jeopardy, possibly over. Her security clearances, which had taken years to obtain and maintain, were suspended and might never be reinstated. Her relationship with her sister, already strained, had crossed into territory that might be irreparable. And somewhere, people engaged in dangerous intelligence work might now be at increased risk because of information that had been compromised in her home. Maya had faced difficult situations before, had operated in hostile environments where mistakes could be fatal, had made decisions with incomplete information and significant consequences. But she had always had clear protocols to follow, defined roles to play, and the structure of military discipline to guide her actions. This situation offered no such clarity. She was simultaneously victim and responsible party, betrayed by her sister but also accountable for failing to adequately secure classified information. She could follow the investigation process, But ultimately her fate would be determined by decisions made by others based on their assessment of her judgment and reliability. The question that haunted her as she sat in the gathering darkness was whether she had made a fundamental error in how she had structured her life. She had poured everything into her career, had maintained only shallow personal relationships outside of work, had kept even family at a distance because she believed professional excellence required such sacrifice. And yet that very isolation had made her vulnerable in ways she had not anticipated. She had no spouse or close friends to provide support or perspective during this crisis. She had subordinated every other priority to her work, and now that work had been taken from her, she found herself with almost nothing else to anchor her identity or give her life meaning. The night stretched ahead of her, empty and threatening. Maya knew she would not sleep, that her mind would replay every decision and conversation, searching for the moment when she could have prevented this catastrophe. But sleep would have to wait. First, she needed to document everything she could remember about the security breach, prepare for the interviews that would come, and begin the work of determining whether her career could be salvaged or whether 15 years of service would end in disgrace because her sister had broken into her files looking for money that did not exist. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street where her neighbors were likely sitting down to dinner or watching television, living ordinary lives untroubled by security clearances or family betrayals. Maya had chosen an extraordinary path, had sought responsibility and challenge, and the opportunity to serve something larger than herself. Now she would learn whether that choice had been worth the price, whether the identity she had built could survive being tested in ways she had never imagined, and whether redemption was possible when trust had been broken and security had been compromised through the actions of someone she had spent her life trying to protect. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service field office in Quantico felt designed to strip away any sense of personal dignity or professional accomplishment. Maya Reeves sat in an interrogation room that masqueraded as a conference space, the bland beige walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere of bureaucratic neutrality that somehow felt more oppressive than overt hostility. A camera mounted in the corner documented everything, its unblinking lens serving as a constant reminder that her words and behavior would be analyzed by people who had already formed preliminary opinions about her reliability and judgment. Special Agent Carson Briggs sat across from her with a younger agent Maya had not met before, a woman in her early 30s who introduced herself as Special Agent Lena Park. Between them lay manila folders containing documentation Maya could not see but could easily imagine. Her service record, her security clearance applications, her background investigation reports, her recent performance evaluations, all the paper trail of a 15-year naval career now being examined for weaknesses and warning signs that should have predicted this security breach. Agent Briggs opened the session by stating that this was a voluntary interview, that Maya had the right to have legal counsel present, and that anything she said could be used in administrative or criminal proceedings. The formality of the Miranda-adjacent warning made clear that despite the conference room setting and the agent's professional courtesy, Maya was being investigated as a potential security threat, rather than simply a victim of her sister's poor judgment. She declined the offer of legal counsel because requesting a lawyer would be interpreted as having something to hide, even though she knew that from a purely tactical standpoint, having representation would be the smarter choice. The questions began with biographical information that NCIS already knew from her security clearance files but wanted to hear in her own words. Where had she grown up? What was her family structure? When had she decided to pursue a military career? The seemingly innocuous queries were designed to establish baseline truthfulness and create a comprehensive picture of her background that could be compared against existing records to identify discrepancies or omissions. Maya had been born in Portland, Oregon, the older daughter of Robert and Catherine Reeves. Her father had worked as a civil engineer for the city's public works department, and her mother had been a high school chemistry teacher. They had lived in a modest split-level house in a middle-class neighborhood where most families looked similar to their own, 2 working parents and 2 children navigating the ordinary challenges of American suburban life. Maya's childhood had been unremarkable in the best possible way, stable and secure, filled with soccer practices and science fairs and family dinners around a table where conversation flowed easily. Everything had changed when Maya was 16 years old, and her mother received a diagnosis of aggressive ovarian cancer. Catherine Reeves had been dead within 7 months, the disease progressing with horrifying speed despite surgery and chemotherapy, and every intervention modern medicine could offer. Maya had watched her mother deteriorate from a vibrant woman in her early 40s to a skeletal figure consumed by pain and medication, losing pieces of herself until only suffering remained. The experience had taught Maya lessons about mortality and loss that most teenagers were spared, had forced her to grow up faster than her peers, and had fundamentally altered her understanding of how quickly security and normalcy could be destroyed. Her father had never recovered from losing his wife. Robert Reeves had continued going to work and maintaining the house and ensuring his daughters had food and shelter, but the emotional core of him had died alongside Catherine. He had become distant and withdrawn, present in body but absent in every meaningful way. Maya had tried to reach him, had attempted to create connection through conversation or shared activities, but her father had retreated into a private grief that had no room for his children's needs. Within a year of Catherine's death, Robert had effectively checked out of active parenting, leaving Maya to manage the household and care for her younger sister, while still trying to navigate her own adolescence and plan for her future. Alexis had been 12 when their mother died, still young enough to need active parenting and emotional support that their father could not provide. Maya had stepped into the maternal role because someone had to, making sure her sister completed homework and attended school and ate proper meals. She had sacrificed her own social life and extracurricular activities to be present for Alexis, had turned down invitations and opportunities because she felt responsible for maintaining some semblance of family stability. The burden had been enormous for a 16-year-old, but Maya had carried it because the alternative was watching her sister suffer neglect in addition to grief. The experience had shaped Maya's character in profound ways, teaching her self-reliance and resilience, but also creating patterns of over-responsibility and difficulty asking for help. She had learned that she could only truly depend on herself, that other people would disappoint or abandon you regardless of their initial commitment, and that vulnerability was dangerous because it required trusting others with your well-being. These lessons had served her well in military service, where self-sufficiency and emotional control were valued traits, but had left her isolated and disconnected from the kinds of deep personal relationships that required reciprocal dependence and emotional transparency. Maya had discovered the Naval Academy through a guidance counselor who had recognized her academic potential and encouraged her to consider military service as a path to both education and purpose. The idea of joining the Navy had appealed to Maya on multiple levels. It offered structure and clear expectations after years of family chaos. It provided a full scholarship that would relieve her father of financial burden he could barely afford. It represented an identity beyond being the responsible daughter who had sacrificed her adolescence to keep her family functioning. And it offered the possibility of belonging to something larger than herself, an institution with clear values and meaningful mission that transcended individual circumstances. The application process had been rigorous, requiring academic excellence, physical fitness, and extensive background investigation. Maya had excelled at every stage, her grades and test scores placing her in the top tier of candidates, her physical conditioning meeting standards that many male applicants struggled to achieve, and her background investigation revealing nothing problematic beyond the family tragedy that had marked her teenage years. She had been accepted to the Naval Academy class entering in the summer after her high school graduation, and she had left Portland with a mixture of relief at escaping her father's house and guilt at abandoning Alexis to their father's inadequate care. The 4 years at Annapolis had transformed Maya in ways both positive and concerning. She had thrived academically, majoring in mathematics with a focus on cryptology, earning grades that qualified her for graduate-level coursework and recognition as a distinguished midshipman. She had excelled in the military training components, demonstrating leadership ability and tactical thinking that earned praise from instructors and respect from peers. She had found genuine friends among her fellow midshipmen, relationships built on shared challenge and mutual support that felt more authentic than most connections from her civilian life. But Maya had also become increasingly closed off emotionally during her academy years, developing habits of privacy and self-containment that went beyond military, bearing into something more troubling. She had rarely discussed her family or background, deflecting personal questions with practiced skill. She had avoided romantic relationships despite interest from classmates, uncomfortable with the vulnerability required for genuine intimacy. She had poured herself into achievement and performance, using external validation as substitute for internal sense of worth, and had structured her identity almost entirely around her role as midshipman and future naval officer. Her relationship with Alexis had deteriorated during the academy years despite Maya's attempts to maintain connection. Alexis had struggled in high school, earning mediocre grades and falling into a peer group that prioritized partying over planning for the future. She had attended a local community college for one semester before dropping out, claiming the coursework was boring and irrelevant to her life. She had worked a series of retail and service jobs, never staying anywhere longer than a few months before quitting, or being fired for attendance problems or conflicts with management. She had dated a succession of men who treated her poorly, drawn to partners who reinforced her low self-esteem rather than challenging her to grow. Maya had tried to help, offering advice and financial support and connections to opportunities that might redirect Alexis toward more productive paths. But her attempts at assistance had been met with resentment and accusations that Maya was judgmental and controlling, that she thought she was better than everyone else because she had escaped to the Naval Academy while Alexis was stuck dealing with their father's depression and the limited opportunities of their hometown. The dynamic had created a painful paradox where Maya felt simultaneously responsible for her sister's well-being and helpless to actually improve her circumstances, guilty for leaving but unable to sacrifice her own future to return home. After commissioning as an ensign, Maya had been assigned to the Naval Security Group Command, the organization responsible for signals intelligence and cryptologic operations before it was reorganized into the information warfare community. Her mathematical aptitude and security clearance made her well-suited for the highly technical work of intercepting and analyzing foreign communications. She had completed extensive training in cryptanalysis, foreign languages including Mandarin and Russian, and the specialized tradecraft required for intelligence operations. The work had been intellectually challenging and deeply classified, providing both stimulation and sense of purpose that Maya had craved. Her early career had progressed smoothly, with strong performance evaluations and increasingly responsible assignments. She had deployed to forward sites in Asia and the Middle East, spending months in secure facilities processing intercepted communications and providing intelligence support to operational commanders. She had earned her graduate degree in applied mathematics through a funded education program, writing her thesis on novel approaches to cryptographic vulnerability assessment. She had been promoted ahead of her peers, selected for positions typically reserved for more senior officers, and groomed for eventual command of cryptologic units. The professional success had come with personal costs that Maya had largely ignored or rationalized. Her relationships had remained superficial, limited to collegial friendships that rarely extended beyond work contexts. She had dated occasionally but never seriously, finding reasons to end relationships before they progressed to levels of commitment that would require genuine emotional investment. She had maintained only minimal contact with her father, who had remarried and started a new family, and seemed content to let his daughters fade into peripheral roles in his life. Her relationship with Alexis had consisted primarily of crisis interventions where Maya provided financial bailouts or practical assistance, while receiving minimal appreciation and no indication that her help actually produced lasting positive change. Maya had told herself that these sacrifices were necessary and worthwhile, that her work served important national security interests that justified personal deprivation, that she was building a career that would provide long-term meaning and satisfaction, even if her personal life remained limited. She had watched other female officers struggle to balance military service with family obligations, had seen talented peers leave active duty because the demands of deployment and operational tempo were incompatible with raising children or maintaining marriages. Maya had chosen to sidestep those conflicts by simply not pursuing the relationships that would create competing loyalties, telling herself this was pragmatic rather than avoidant. The progression to her current position as a lieutenant commander had represented the culmination of 15 years of focused effort and consistent excellence. She had been assigned to lead a cryptologic analysis team, focused on identifying and countering foreign intelligence operations targeting American military personnel. The work required both technical expertise in counterintelligence tradecraft, analyzing patterns in communications and behaviors to identify service members who were being targeted for recruitment by hostile intelligence services. The assignment was prestigious and carried significant responsibility, with Maya's assessments directly informing decisions about security clearances and counterintelligence investigations. The irony was devastating. Maya had spent years identifying security risks in other people, analyzing patterns of behavior and association that might indicate vulnerability to foreign recruitment or careless handling of classified information. She had written reports that ended careers and recommended denial of clearances, based on security concerns far less serious than having unauthorized personnel access classified files in one's home. She had prided herself on rigorous application of security standards, never letting personal sympathy or friendship cloud her professional judgment about who could be trusted with sensitive information. And now she sat on the other side of that process, being evaluated by colleagues who would apply those same merciless standards to assess whether she represented an unacceptable security risk. Special Agent Park asked about Maya's relationship with Alexis, specifically focusing on the financial support Maya had provided over the years. The question suggested that investigators had already conducted thorough analysis of Maya's bank records, identifying every transfer and payment made to her sister, and constructing a timeline of financial dependence. Maya explained that she had helped Alexis with rent payments during periods of unemployment, had covered medical bills when Alexis lacked insurance, had paid for car repairs and security deposits, and various other expenses that arose from her sister's chaotic financial management. The total amount over the years was substantial, probably exceeding $30,000, money that Maya could afford because of her stable income and careful budgeting, but that represented a significant portion of her savings. Agent Briggs asked whether Maya had ever discussed her work with Alexis in any detail. Maya confirmed that she had maintained strict boundaries about operational information, never sharing specifics about her assignments or the nature of the intelligence her team processed. But she acknowledged having discussed general aspects of military life, explaining deployments and training exercises in vague terms when Alexis asked where she was going or what she was doing. She had never revealed classified information, but she recognized now that even general discussions might have given Alexis enough context to understand that Maya had access to sensitive materials, and to imagine that those materials might contain valuable information. The questioning shifted to Maya's home security practices, and Agent Park asked detailed questions about how Maya stored classified materials, whether she ever brought work home on portable media, and what precautions she took to prevent unauthorized access to her devices. Maya explained that she followed all required protocols for handling classified information, never removing materials from secure facilities, always using encrypted communications for classified discussions, and maintaining strict separation between her work and personal digital environments. But she acknowledged that several months earlier she had accidentally downloaded controlled files to her personal laptop while working on an administrative task that involved both classified and unclassified systems, and she had not immediately deleted those files as protocol required. The admission hung in the air, and Maya could see both agents making notes while maintaining neutral expressions. This was the critical failure point in her security practices, the moment when her usually rigorous discipline had lapsed and created vulnerability that her sister had later exploited. Maya explained that she had intended to delete the files but had been called away to an urgent meeting, and the task had slipped her mind amid competing priorities. The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears, a transparent rationalization for negligence that fell well below the standards she had always maintained. She had made a mistake, had failed to immediately correct it, and that failure had created the opportunity for this disaster. Agent Briggs asked whether anyone else knew about the files on Maya's personal laptop. Maya confirmed that she had not discussed the download error with anyone, had not sought guidance from security officers about proper remediation, and had simply assumed she would remember to delete the files when she had a free moment. The decision reflected exactly the kind of casual approach to security that Maya would have identified as concerning if she had observed it in anyone else. It demonstrated both poor judgment and a troubling willingness to deviate from established protocols, precisely the behaviors that predicted greater security problems over time. The interview continued for another 90 minutes, covering every aspect of Maya's background, her relationship with Alexis, her security practices, and her explanation for how the breach had occurred. By the time the agents indicated they had no further questions for this session, Maya felt emotionally exhausted and psychologically stripped bare. Every private detail of her life had been examined and documented, every past decision scrutinized for evidence of judgment failure or security consciousness, every relationship analyzed for potential compromise or manipulation. She had been reduced from an accomplished naval officer to a collection of risk factors and protocol violations, assessed not for her 15 years of excellent service but for the single catastrophic failure that had compromised her trustworthiness. Walking out of the NCS building into the bright Virginia afternoon, Maya felt disoriented by the contrast between the sterile interrogation environment and the normal world continuing around her. People drove past on routine errands, students from the nearby Marine Corps base jogged in formation along the road, families pushed strollers and walked dogs in the pleasant spring weather. Their lives continued unchanged while Maya's entire existence had been suspended in bureaucratic limbo, waiting for investigators to determine whether she would be allowed to resume her career or would be forced to find new identity and purpose after having the only life she had built systematically dismantled. Her phone contained multiple missed calls and voicemails, including messages from Captain Torres asking for updates, from colleagues expressing concern and offering support, and from her father asking vague questions about whether everything was all right after Alexis had called him in tears claiming that Maya had gotten her arrested. Maya deleted the message from her father without listening to the entire thing, unable to summon the emotional energy required to navigate his predictable attempt to make Maya responsible for managing the situation and soothing Alexis's distress. She drove home in a fog of exhaustion and dread, her mind replaying moments from the interview where her answers had sounded inadequate or defensive. She analyzed her word choices and tone, wondering whether she had inadvertently created impressions of evasiveness or lack of accountability. The paranoia was probably excessive, but after hours of being interrogated by professionals trained to identify deception and assess credibility, Maya found it impossible to trust her own judgment about how the session had gone. The townhouse felt foreign when she entered, no longer the sanctuary she had carefully created, but now a crime scene that had been thoroughly processed by federal investigators. They had returned some of her personal items that were not relevant to the investigation, but her laptop and other electronic devices remained in government custody, being forensically analyzed to determine exactly what Alexis had accessed and whether any information had been transmitted to external parties. The absence of her computer felt like losing a limb, so much of her personal and professional life stored in devices that were now being examined by strangers looking for evidence of her negligence or worse. Maya changed out of her dress uniform into civilian clothes, made herself eat something despite having no appetite, and tried to think clearly about her situation and what actions might improve her prospects. The investigation would take weeks or months to complete, during which time she would remain on administrative leave with no access to classified systems or facilities. Her security clearances were suspended, which meant she could not perform the work that constituted her entire professional identity. She would receive full pay during the administrative leave, but money was the least of her concerns when her career and reputation hung in the balance. She needed legal counsel despite her earlier decision to proceed without representation. The Navy Judge Advocate General's office could provide free legal assistance, but those attorneys served the military institution rather than individual service members, and might not aggressively defend her interests if doing so conflicted with the Navy's preferred outcome. A civilian attorney specializing in military justice and security clearance cases would be expensive, but would owe loyalty exclusively to Maya rather than to the service. She began researching attorneys who handled these types of cases, reading reviews and credentials and trying to assess who might be best positioned to help her navigate this disaster. She also needed to address the situation with Alexis, though exactly how to do that remained unclear. Her sister was facing potential federal charges for unauthorized access to government computer systems, charges that could result in prison time if prosecutors decided to make an example of her. Part of Maya wanted to let Alexis face the full consequences of her actions without intervention, to finally allow natural consequences to operate without Maya providing rescue or mitigation. But she recognized that the vindictive impulse came from anger and hurt rather than considered judgment, and she felt obligated to at least ensure Alexis had competent legal representation, even if their relationship was permanently damaged. The situation raised fundamental questions about how Maya had structured her life and what she valued. She had subordinated everything to her career, had made countless sacrifices in service of professional excellence, had built her identity almost entirely around being a naval officer and intelligence professional. Now that foundation was crumbling, and she was forced to confront how little else existed in her life to provide meaning or support. She had no spouse or children, No deep friendships outside of work contexts, no hobbies or passions beyond the professional sphere, no community involvement or spiritual practice. She had spent 15 years building a career fortress while neglecting to create anything else that might sustain her if that fortress collapsed. The realization was devastating but also potentially clarifying. If she survived this investigation with her career intact, she would need to make fundamental changes in how she balanced professional demands with personal development. If she did not survive, if her career ended in disgrace or administrative separation, she would need to construct an entirely new identity and find meaning in domains she had largely ignored during her adult life. Either outcome required growth and change that would be uncomfortable and difficult, but potentially necessary regardless of the investigation's result. Maya spent the evening drafting a detailed timeline of events, documenting everything she could remember about the security breach and her discovery of Alexis in her home office. The written account would be useful for her attorney and might help her maintain consistent recollection during future interviews when memory naturally degraded over time. The process of writing also helped her process the emotional impact of the situation, converting overwhelming feelings into structured narrative that felt more manageable, even if no less serious. Around midnight, her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She answered cautiously, identifying herself by first name only rather than rank. The voice on the other end belonged to Alexis, who had apparently been released after her NCIS interview, and was calling from a borrowed phone because her own devices had been seized as evidence. Alexis launched immediately into a tearful apology, saying she knew she had destroyed everything and ruined Maya's life, and would understand if Maya never spoke to her again. Maya listened without responding, waiting for the emotional storm to pass and for her sister to reach some approximation of calm. When Alexis finally stopped talking, Maya said quietly that she needed to know the complete truth about what had happened and why. She needed to understand what had motivated Alexis to hire someone to hack into her computer, what Alexis had been looking for, and whether there was any truth to the claim about searching for information about a trust fund, or whether that had been a convenient lie. There was a long silence before Alexis admitted that the trust fund story had been fabricated, an excuse she thought would be more acceptable than the truth. The real motivation had been financial desperation combined with wild hope that Maya might have hidden money or assets that Alexis could access. She owed money to several creditors who were threatening legal action. Her car was about to be repossessed, and she faced eviction from her apartment unless she produced 2 months of back rent. She had been searching through Maya's digital files looking for bank account information or investment statements, hoping to find something she could use to pressure Maya into providing more financial support. The admission was both clarifying and enraging. Alexis had committed a federal crime, compromised national security, and potentially destroyed Maya's career not because of any noble motivation or genuine confusion, but simply because she wanted access to Maya's money and was willing to break any boundary to get it. The betrayal was complete and absolute, demonstrating that whatever Alexis felt for Maya, it was not love or respect or gratitude for years of support and sacrifice. Maya told her sister that she would arrange for legal counsel because Alexis was facing serious federal charges and needed professional representation, but that beyond ensuring access to an attorney, Maya would not be providing any further assistance or support. Their relationship, such as it had been, was over. Alexis could not be trusted, could not be helped, and could not be allowed to remain in Maya's life in any capacity. The decision was painful but necessary, a boundary that should have been established years earlier before the dysfunction had been allowed to progress this far. Alexis began crying again and begging Maya not to abandon her, saying she had no one else and would not survive the legal process without Maya's support. But Maya was done being manipulated by her sister's tears and claims of helplessness. She ended the call without further discussion and blocked the number Alexis had used, recognizing that maintaining any contact would only create ongoing problems and prevent her from focusing on salvaging what remained of her own life. She sat for a long time in the darkness of her townhouse, feeling the weight of loneliness but also recognizing it as honest rather than false. She had been functionally alone for years while maintaining the illusion of family connection with Alexis, providing one-way support in a relationship that offered nothing in return. Acknowledging that reality and acting accordingly was painful but also strangely liberating. A release from obligations that had never been reciprocated or appreciated. The path forward remained unclear and frightening, But Maya knew she possessed resources that would help her navigate whatever came next. She had intelligence and determination, she had faced difficult challenges before, and she had survived losses that had destroyed her sense of security and normalcy. This was another loss, another challenge, and she would approach it with the same discipline and focus she had brought to every other obstacle in her life. The outcome was uncertain, but giving up was not an option because she had spent too many years building something meaningful to surrender without exhausting every possible avenue for preservation or redemption. The law office of Patricia Holloway occupied the 10th floor of a glass tower in downtown Washington, with views stretching across the Potomac toward the Pentagon and Arlington National Cemetery. Maya Reeves sat in the reception area surrounded by polished marble and contemporary art, feeling acutely aware that every minute she spent waiting represented billable hours she could barely afford. The retainer alone had required liquidating a significant portion of her savings, and Patricia Holloway's hourly rate meant that extended legal representation would consume whatever financial security Maya had built over 15 years of careful budgeting and modest living. Patricia Holloway emerged from her office with the confident bearing of someone who had spent 3 decades navigating the intersection of military law and national security cases. She was in her early 60s with silver hair cut in a precise bob, wearing a navy suit that projected both professionalism and understated authority. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and her initial assessment of Maya seemed to occur in the seconds before she spoke, a rapid evaluation that Maya recognized from her own intelligence work as the mark of someone trained to read people quickly and accurately. The office reflected its occupants' career and reputation. Framed photographs showed Patricia Holloway with various military and political figures, documenting a professional network that extended into the highest levels of defense and intelligence communities. Her law degree from Georgetown hung alongside certificates recognizing her contributions to military justice reform and national security policy. The bookshelves contain volumes on constitutional law, military regulations, and classified information security, the reference materials of someone who had built expertise in the complex legal territory Maya now found herself navigating. Patricia began by explaining her approach to security clearance cases and the realistic assessment of what Maya faced. The NCIS investigation would be thorough and would likely take between 3 and 6 months to complete. During that time, investigators would interview everyone who had regular contact with Maya, would forensically analyze her electronic devices and those of her sister, would review her entire service record for any prior indicators of security consciousness problems, and would assess whether the breach represented an isolated incident or a pattern of poor judgment. The standard they would apply was not whether Maya had intentionally compromised classified information, but whether she had demonstrated the reliability and trustworthiness required to hold a security clearance and serve in positions of special trust and confidence. The legal framework governing security clearances was deliberately broad and gave adjudicators wide discretion to deny or revoke access based on any circumstances that raised legitimate questions about an individual's judgment, reliability, or ability to protect classified information. The fact that Maya had not intentionally caused the breach was relevant but not determinative. What mattered more was that she had created the vulnerability through her failure to properly secure controlled files, that a family member with financial problems had been able to exploit that vulnerability, and that operational security had been compromised as a result. These facts established a pattern that clearance adjudicators were trained to view with extreme skepticism, regardless of the individual's prior service record or stated commitment to security. Patricia asked detailed questions about the files that Alexis had accessed, pressing for specifics about classification levels, handling requirements, and the operational programs those files related to. Maya explained that the materials were marked as for official use only and controlled unclassified information, technical classifications that fell below the threshold of secret or top secret, but still required protection from unauthorized disclosure. The files contained information about counterintelligence operations including source identities, investigative techniques, and ongoing cases targeting foreign intelligence activities. While not classified at the highest levels, the information was operationally sensitive and could compromise investigations or endanger sources if disclosed to hostile parties. The conversation shifted to Alexis and the criminal charges she faced. Patricia explained that unauthorized access to government computer systems carried serious federal penalties under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, with potential sentences ranging from probation to 5 years imprisonment, depending on aggravating factors and prosecutorial discretion. The fact that Alexis had access files related to national security operations made the case more serious than typical computer intrusion charges. However, the fact that she had no prior criminal record, no apparent connection to foreign intelligence services, and had acted out of financial desperation rather than espionage motives suggested that prosecutors might be willing to negotiate a plea agreement rather than pursuing maximum penalties. Patricia asked whether Maya wanted to be involved in Alexis's legal defense, and her tone made clear that she was testing whether Maya understood the importance of maintaining boundaries. Maya stated unequivocally that she had arranged for Alexis to have competent legal counsel through a public defender, but would not be providing financial support for private representation or otherwise involving herself in her sister's case. The relationship was terminated, and Maya's focus needed to remain entirely on protecting her own career and security clearance, rather than continuing patterns of enabling her sister's dysfunction. Patricia nodded approvingly at this response and explained that maintaining clear separation from Alexis would be critical to Maya's case. The adjudicators would be evaluating whether Maya's family relationships created ongoing security vulnerabilities and demonstrating that she had severed ties with the family member who had compromised security would weigh in her favor. It would show that Maya prioritized security obligations over family loyalty when the two came into conflict, exactly the kind of judgment clearance holders were expected to demonstrate. The decision would be personally painful but professionally necessary, and Patricia made clear that any wavering or continued contact with Alexis would be viewed as evidence that Maya had not fully internalized the seriousness of the breach or her responsibility for preventing future vulnerabilities. The discussion turned to strategy for Maya's defense, and Patricia outlined the approach they would take. First, they would compile comprehensive documentation of Maya's 15-year service record, gathering performance evaluations, awards, letters of commendation, and testimony from supervisors and colleagues about her reliability and security consciousness. The goal was to establish that the laptop incident represented an aberration rather than a pattern, an isolated mistake in an otherwise exemplary career characterized by scrupulous adherence to security protocols. Second, they would obtain expert analysis of the forensic examination of Maya's devices, ensuring that the investigation's findings were accurately interpreted and that any exculpatory evidence was properly presented to adjudicators. Third, they would prepare Maya for the personal appearance hearing that would follow the investigation, coaching her on how to present herself and respond to questions in ways that demonstrated accountability without appearing to make excuses or minimize the seriousness of the breach. Patricia also explained the likely timeline for various decision points in the process. The NCIS investigation would conclude with a report of findings that would be forwarded to the Central Adjudication Facility, the organization responsible for making security clearance determinations for military personnel. The adjudication process itself typically took several months, during which Maya's case would be reviewed by security specialists who would assess the totality of circumstances and make recommendations about whether her clearances should be reinstated, suspended pending additional conditions, or permanently revoked. If the initial adjudication was unfavorable, Maya would have the right to appeal and to appear personally before the adjudication board to present her case and respond to concerns. The entire process from breach to final determination often took a year or more, meaning Maya faced an extended period of professional limbo, regardless of the ultimate outcome. The financial implications were sobering. Even with Patricia's somewhat reduced rate for military clients, legal fees for full representation through the appeals process would likely exceed $50,000. Maya had perhaps $30,000 in liquid savings after paying the initial retainer, which meant she would need to access retirement accounts or take loans if the case extended beyond a few months. The prospect of depleting her life savings to defend herself against consequences of her sister's criminal behavior created a bitter irony that was not lost on Maya. She had spent years providing financial support to Alexis, and now Alexis's actions would force Maya to exhaust whatever resources remained. Patricia asked about Maya's emotional state and support systems, explaining that clearance cases created enormous psychological pressure and that many clients struggled with depression, anxiety, and social isolation during the investigation period. The suspension of professional identity combined with uncertainty about the future and social stigma associated with being under investigation created a toxic combination that could overwhelm even resilient individuals. Patricia strongly recommended that Maya engage with mental health services, both because psychological support would help her cope with the stress, and because demonstrating that she was proactively addressing the emotional impact would be viewed favorably by adjudicators assessing her overall stability and judgment. Maya acknowledged that her support network was limited, consisting primarily of professional relationships that had been suspended along with her clearances and access to classified facilities. She had no spouse or close family beyond the father and sister she was no longer in contact with. Her friendships were real but not particularly deep, built on shared professional interests rather than intimate personal connection. The isolation was partly circumstantial but mostly reflected choices Maya had made about how to structure her life, prioritizing career advancement over relationship cultivation, in ways that now left her vulnerable during crisis. Patricia suggested several resources including therapists who specialized in working with military personnel facing career-threatening situations, support groups for individuals under security clearance investigation, and professional coaches who could help Maya think strategically about career alternatives if her clearances were ultimately revoked. The implicit message was that Maya needed to begin preparing psychologically and practically for the possibility that her naval career was over, that hoping for restoration of clearances should not prevent her from developing contingency plans for rebuilding her professional identity in civilian contexts that did not require security clearances. The meeting concluded with Patricia providing a detailed retainer agreement and timeline of expected activities over the next several months. Maya signed the paperwork with the strange feeling that she was authorizing someone else to fight a battle she should be fighting herself, surrendering control to a hired advocate, because the system did not permit her to effectively represent her own interests. The feeling was uncomfortable for someone accustomed to direct action and personal accountability, but she recognized it as necessary. Legal proceedings required specialized expertise, and attempting to navigate the process without professional representation would be foolish economy that would likely result in worse outcomes than the financial cost of competent counsel. Leaving the law office, Maya felt simultaneously relieved to have engaged expert help and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. The investigation, the adjudication, the potential appeals, the financial burden, the psychological toll, the uncertainty stretching across months or years, all of it represented a marathon of endurance that would test every resource she possessed. The immediate crisis of discovering Alexis in her home office had been shocking and frightening, but at least it had been acute and time-limited. This new phase was characterized by grinding uncertainty and passive waiting, requiring a different kind of resilience than Maya had cultivated through her military service. She walked several blocks through downtown Washington, needing movement and fresh air after the intensity of the legal consultation. The city bustled with tourists and office workers enjoying the spring afternoon, people pursuing their ordinary lives while Maya's existence remained suspended in bureaucratic limbo. She felt disconnected from the normal world, marked by her circumstances in ways that were invisible to strangers, but felt like wearing a sign announcing her disgrace and uncertainty. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Torres requesting a meeting to discuss her situation and administrative issues related to her suspended status. Maya responded that she was available at his convenience and could come to his office or meet elsewhere if he preferred to avoid having her on base while her clearances were suspended. He replied that they should meet at a coffee shop near the Pentagon, neutral territory that would allow for candid conversation without the constraints of official environment or the visibility of meeting in his office where other personnel might observe and speculate. Maya arrived at the designated coffee shop 30 minutes early, purchasing a drink she did not want and claiming a corner table that offered privacy and clear sightlines to the entrance. The habits of operational security remained even when she had no operations to secure, instincts trained into her through years of working in environments where awareness and caution were professional requirements. She recognized the tendency toward hypervigilance as a stress response but did not try to suppress it, accepting that her nervous system would remain activated until the threat to her career and reputation was resolved one way or another. Captain Torres arrived precisely on time, dressed in civilian clothes rather than uniform, suggesting he wanted this conversation to feel personal rather than official. He was in his late 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in military service, carrying himself with confidence that came from clear hierarchy and defined roles. He had been Maya's commanding officer for 2 years, and their professional relationship had been characterized by mutual respect and effective collaboration. He had written enthusiastic performance evaluations praising her technical expertise and leadership abilities, and he had supported her selection for increasingly responsible positions. Now he sat across from her with an expression mixing sympathy and professional concern, facing the uncomfortable task of managing a subordinate whose career might be ending in circumstances that reflected poorly on his command. He began by asking how she was holding up, and his tone suggested genuine interest rather than perfunctory courtesy. Maya gave an honest assessment, acknowledging that the situation was stressful and frightening, but that she was managing through combination of legal representation, deliberate self-care, and focus on what she could control rather than fixating on uncertainties beyond her influence. She thanked him for his support and acknowledged that her situation created awkwardness for him as her commanding officer, potentially raising questions about his supervision, and whether he should have detected warning signs of security consciousness problems before they manifested in actual breach. Captain Torres dismissed her concern about his reputation, saying that commanders were expected to support their people through difficult circumstances, and that he had no doubt about Maya's integrity or commitment to security. He acknowledged that the laptop incident represented a mistake, but characterized it as the kind of isolated lapse that could happen to anyone under pressure of competing demands and insufficient time. He said he had already provided a statement to NCIS investigators emphasizing Maya's exemplary service record and his confidence in her reliability, and he would continue to advocate for her throughout the adjudication process. The conversation shifted to practical matters related to Maya's administrative status during the investigation period. She would remain on full pay but would not be assigned to any duties requiring security clearance or access to classified facilities. This meant she could not perform her normal work, and would essentially be in a holding pattern until the investigation concluded. Captain Torres suggested she could potentially be assigned to administrative tasks or training activities that did not require clearances, which would keep her engaged and demonstrate willingness to contribute even while under investigation. Alternatively, she could simply remain on administrative leave, which would give her more flexibility, but might be interpreted as disengagement or lack of commitment to service. Maya asked for his recommendation, and Captain Torres advised that she should request specific administrative duties that would keep her visible and engaged without creating additional complications. The appearance of normalcy and continued contribution to the command would work in her favor, suggesting that she viewed the investigation as temporary disruption rather than career-ending catastrophe. He could arrange for her to work on unclassified projects including training program development, administrative process improvements, and personnel management tasks that needed attention but had been deferred due to operational priorities. They discussed the investigation timeline and what Captain Torres had heard through informal channels about how the case was being handled. NCIS appeared to be conducting thorough but not hostile investigation, treating the incident as potential security violation rather than suspected espionage. Alexis's interviews had apparently been consistent with what Maya had reported, confirming that she had acted alone motivated by financial desperation rather than foreign direction or ideological motivation. The forensic analysis of electronic devices was ongoing, but preliminary findings suggested that Alexis had accessed files during a single session and had not transmitted any information to external parties or made copies beyond what was found on Maya's laptop. This information was encouraging but not determinative. Even if the investigation confirmed that damage had been limited and that Maya had not been complicit in the breach, adjudicators would still need to assess whether her security practices and judgment met the standards required for continued clearance eligibility. The key question was whether the laptop incident demonstrated a concerning pattern of casual attitude toward security, or whether it could be credibly characterized as isolated mistake inconsistent with Maya's overall approach to handling sensitive information. Captain Torres then raised a more sensitive topic, asking whether Maya had considered what she would do if her clearances were permanently revoked and her naval career effectively ended. The question was difficult but necessary, an acknowledgement that despite everyone's best efforts and hopes, the adjudication process might conclude that Maya represented an unacceptable security risk, regardless of her prior service record or demonstrated competence. He emphasized that he believed this outcome was unlikely, but that prudent planning required considering all possibilities including worst-case scenarios. Maya admitted that she had begun thinking about contingency plans but found the prospect of civilian career almost impossible to conceptualize. Her entire adult life had been structured around military service, her identity was inseparable from her role as naval officer, and her skills were highly specialized in domains that had limited civilian application. Cryptologic analysis and signals intelligence were not easily transferable to private sector contexts, and the jobs that did exist in defense contracting or government agencies would almost certainly require security clearances that she would not possess if the adjudication went against her. Captain Torres suggested that Maya's skills were more portable than she realized, that analytical thinking and technical expertise applied across many domains beyond their specific military applications. He mentioned several former intelligence officers who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers in cybersecurity, data science, financial analysis, and technology consulting. The transition required reframing how she understood her capabilities and being willing to enter new fields at levels below what her military rank and experience might suggest she deserved, but opportunities existed for people willing to approach career change with humility and openness to learning. The conversation provided both comfort and additional anxiety, reassurance that people survived career transitions even after devastating setbacks, but also stark reminder that Maya faced potential loss of everything she had built over 15 years of dedicated service. Captain Torres emphasized that he remained optimistic about her prospects for clearance restoration, but that she should use the investigation period productively, potentially pursuing additional education or certifications that would strengthen either her military career if clearances were restored or her civilian career prospects if they were not. They concluded the meeting with Captain Torres reiterating his support and providing his personal cell phone number with instructions that Maya should contact him directly if she needed anything or encountered problems during the investigation period. The gesture felt genuine rather than obligatory, suggesting that despite the professional awkwardness of the situation, he viewed her as a valuable officer who had made a serious mistake rather than as damaged goods to be discarded at first opportunity. Walking back to her car, Maya felt marginally more grounded than she had before the meeting. The investigation remained terrifying and the outcome uncertain, but she had begun assembling the resources and support necessary to navigate the process as effectively as possible. She had competent legal counsel who understood both the technical aspects of security clearance law and the practical realities of military culture. She had a commanding officer willing to advocate for her and provide practical support during the administrative limbo. She had begun accepting the reality of her situation rather than remaining in denial or paralyzed by shock. The path forward required actions that went against Maya's instincts and preferences. She would need to ask for help rather than relying entirely on her own capabilities. She would need to tolerate uncertainty and lack of control, rather than demanding clarity and definitive answers. She would need to develop aspects of her identity beyond her professional role, rather than continuing to derive all meaning and value from her naval service. She would need to maintain hope without becoming dependent on specific outcomes, preparing emotionally for both success and failure in ways that would allow her to continue functioning regardless of the adjudication result. That evening, Maya sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and began writing out what she had learned during her legal consultation and meeting with Captain Torres. The act of documentation helped her process information and identify action items that would give her sense of agency during period when so much remained beyond her control. She created lists of evidence to gather for her legal defense, professional contacts who might provide character references, skills she possessed that could transfer to civilian contexts, and psychological resources she should access to support her mental health during extended uncertainty. She also began drafting a personal statement that Patricia Holloway had recommended she prepare, a detailed account of the laptop incident from her perspective including acknowledgement of her mistake, explanation of the circumstances that contributed to the security lapse, description of lessons learned, and commitment to enhanced security practices going forward. The statement would be submitted to adjudicators as part of her defense package, and it needed to strike careful balance between accepting responsibility and providing context, demonstrating accountability without appearing to make excuses or minimize the seriousness of the breach. Writing the statement forced Maya to articulate what had actually happened in those months before her deployment, when she had downloaded controlled files to her personal laptop and then failed to immediately delete them. She had been working on an unclassified administrative report that required reference to operational data, and she had been switching rapidly between classified and unclassified systems trying to complete the report before a deadline. In her haste and distraction, she had downloaded several files to the wrong device, realized the error immediately, but had been interrupted by an urgent phone call before she could correct the mistake. When she returned to her desk 30 minutes later, the immediate crisis had passed and other priorities had captured her attention. She had made mental note to delete the files but had never converted that intention into action, and the task had simply been forgotten amid the overwhelming volume of competing demands on her time and attention. The explanation was honest but also revealed patterns that were concerning from security perspective. Maya had been rushed, distracted, and insufficiently attentive to the task she was performing. She had allowed urgent but less important matters to interrupt handling of sensitive materials. She had relied on memory rather than immediate action to ensure proper security procedures were followed. She had prioritized operational tempo and mission accomplishment over the administrative task of properly securing files she had mishandled. Each of these factors represented exactly the kind of judgment failure that security professionals were trained to identify as warning signs of increased risk. Maya recognized that the adjudicators would view her account through this critical lens, that they would see not just an isolated mistake, but evidence of attitudes and practices that predicted future problems. Her defense would need to demonstrate that she understood these implications, that she had reflected deeply on how her approach to security had been inadequate despite years of training and emphasis on the importance of protecting classified information, and that she had fundamentally changed how she thought about these obligations. The challenge was making this claim credible when the evidence suggested that her security consciousness had not been sufficient to prevent serious breach, that despite knowing intellectually what was required, she had failed to consistently translate that knowledge into behavior. The work of drafting the statement continued late into the night, with Maya writing and revising and struggling to find language that was simultaneously honest, accountable, and persuasive. She wanted to acknowledge her mistakes without appearing to grovel or engage in excessive self-criticism. She wanted to provide context without seeming to shift blame or minimize her responsibility. She wanted to demonstrate growth and learning without claiming transformation that would ring false given the limited time since the incident occurred. The balance was difficult to achieve, and she eventually set aside the draft recognizing that it would require multiple iterations and probably input from Patricia Holloway before it was ready for submission. Looking at the clock and realizing it was past midnight, Maya finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had been accumulating throughout the day. The legal consultation, the meeting with Captain Torres, the work on her defense statement, all of it had required sustained focus and emotional regulation that had depleted her resources. She needed rest, but she also felt reluctant to surrender to sleep, because unconsciousness meant temporary escape from problems that would still be waiting when she woke. She thought about the moment when she had walked into her townhouse and found Alexis at her laptop, the instant when her world had shifted from stable to catastrophic. That moment felt simultaneously like it had happened years ago, and like it had occurred hours earlier, time distorted by the intensity of everything that had followed. She recognized that regardless of the investigation outcome, she had been fundamentally changed by the experience, that she could never return to the person she had been before discovering her sister's betrayal and facing the consequences of her own security failures. The question was what kind of person she would become through this crucible, whether the experience would ultimately strengthen her or break her, whether she would emerge with deeper wisdom and resilience or simply with more scars and diminished capacity for trust. The answer would be determined partly by circumstances beyond her control but mostly by how she chose to respond to those circumstances, what meaning she made of the suffering, and whether she could transform what felt like destruction into opportunity for genuine growth and change. The path ahead remained unclear and frightening, but Maya knew she possessed the fundamental capabilities required to navigate it. She had survived loss and hardship before, had rebuilt after setbacks and disappointments, and had demonstrated throughout her life the capacity to endure and adapt when circumstances demanded it. This was another test, perhaps the most consequential of her life, and she would face it with whatever resources she could marshal and whatever courage she could maintain through the darkness and uncertainty. The waiting period that followed the initial investigation interviews stretched into weeks that felt simultaneously endless and alarmingly fast. Maya Reeves established routines designed to impose structure on days that otherwise threatened to dissolve into anxious rumination and unproductive worry. She woke each morning at 5:30, maintaining the schedule her body had learned during years of military service, and she forced herself through physical training that her suspended status no longer required but that provided essential psychological stability. Running through the pre-dawn streets of Alexandria, she found temporary respite from the constant mental rehearsal of worst-case scenarios and the obsessive analysis of every decision that had led to her current circumstances. The administrative duties Captain Torres had arranged gave her somewhere to go during normal working hours, though the work itself felt hollow and disconnected from her actual capabilities. She had been assigned to a training development office where she reviewed curriculum materials for junior intelligence analysts and provided feedback on instructional approaches. The work required no security clearance and drew on her experience without demanding the kind of intense focus that had characterized her operational assignments. Her colleagues in the training office treated her with careful courtesy that suggested they knew something had happened, but had not been informed of specifics, maintaining professional distance that felt isolating even as she understood their caution. Maya had begun seeing a therapist, Dr. Rachel Chan, who specialized in working with military personnel facing career-threatening situations. The weekly sessions provided space to process emotions that Maya normally suppressed or channeled into productive action, forcing her to acknowledge fear and grief and anger that she would have preferred to ignore. Dr. Chan had explained that the investigation period created a particular kind of psychological torture because it combined high stakes with complete lack of control, triggering stress responses that could not be resolved through fight or flight, because neither option was available. The only adaptive response was acceptance of uncertainty and tolerance of discomfort, skills that ran counter to the action-oriented mindset Maya had cultivated throughout her military career. During their fourth session, Dr. Chan had asked Maya to describe her identity beyond her role as naval officer and intelligence professional. The question had stopped Maya cold, forcing her to confront how completely she had merged her sense of self with her professional position. When asked who she was apart from her rank and assignments, Maya had struggled to articulate any coherent answer. She was a runner, though that hobby existed primarily as physical fitness maintenance for military service. She was a reader, though most of her reading related to professional development or technical subjects relevant to her work. She enjoyed hiking and photography, though both interests had been largely dormant during years of operational tempo and deployment cycles. The poverty of her non-professional identity had been embarrassingly evident, revealing the extent to which she had allowed work to consume dimensions of self that should have remained distinct and independently nourished. Dr. Chan had assigned homework requiring Maya to engage in activities completely unrelated to military service or intelligence work, deliberately cultivating aspects of identity that would survive regardless of clearance adjudication outcomes. Maya had resisted initially, viewing the assignment as distraction from the serious work of preparing her legal defense and managing the investigation. But she had gradually recognized the wisdom in developing parts of herself that were not contingent on external validation or institutional affiliation, creating foundations of identity that could provide stability if her career collapsed. She had joined a community pottery class, an activity so foreign to her analytical and technical orientation that it felt almost transgressive. Working with clay required different kinds of attention and skill than cryptologic analysis, demanded patience with imperfection and acceptance of outcomes she could only partially control, and produced tangible objects whose value had nothing to do with mission accomplishment or national security. The first several sessions had been frustrating as her hands refused to execute what her mind envisioned, the clay collapsing or warping despite her careful efforts at shaping it. But gradually she had begun to appreciate the meditative quality of the work, the way focusing on immediate physical sensations and simple goals created respite from the constant anxiety about her uncertain future. The pottery studio had also provided unexpected social connection with people who knew nothing about her military service or current professional crisis. Her classmates were diverse in age and background, united only by interest in learning a craft that demanded nothing beyond willingness to work with materials and tolerate the inevitable failures that preceded any competence. Maya found herself enjoying conversations about entirely ordinary topics, discussing weekend plans and family activities, and the minor frustrations of daily life with people whose biggest problems involved traffic and home repairs rather than security clearances and federal investigations. The normalcy was both comforting and destabilizing. reminding her that most people lived without the hypervigilance and existential stakes that had characterized her professional existence. 6 weeks after the initial breach, Maya received notification that NCIS had completed its investigation and forwarded findings to the Central Adjudication Facility for clearance determination. Patricia Holloway called to discuss the investigation report, which she had obtained through proper channels and reviewed in detail. The findings were mixed, neither completely exonerating Maya nor condemning her as fundamentally unreliable. The investigation had confirmed that Alexis had acted alone without foreign direction or ideological motivation, that the files accessed had not been transmitted to external parties, and that Maya had no prior history of security violations or concerns. These findings established that the incident was isolated rather than part of a pattern, and that no classified information had actually been compromised to hostile intelligence services. However, the investigation had also documented several concerning factors that would weigh against Maya during adjudication. The forensic analysis had revealed that controlled files had remained on her personal laptop for approximately 3 months before Alexis accessed them, demonstrating that Maya's failure to delete them had not been a brief oversight, but rather an extended period of negligence. The investigation had identified other minor security infractions in Maya's history, including 2 occasions when she had failed to properly secure classified materials at the end of her workday, violations that had been corrected immediately and documented only in internal security logs, but that now appeared in her record as evidence of insufficient security consciousness. Multiple colleagues interviewed during the investigation had described Maya as sometimes rushed and distracted when handling administrative security tasks, prioritizing operational demands over careful compliance with protocols, a characterization that suggested the laptop incident reflected broader patterns rather than unique circumstances. Patricia explained that these findings would form the basis for the adjudication decision, and that Maya's case would likely be classified as what was termed a close call, situations where legitimate arguments existed on both sides, and where outcomes depended heavily on how adjudicators weighed competing factors. The positive elements of Maya's service record and the absence of malicious intent or actual compromise would argue for restoration of clearances, while the evidence of security consciousness deficiencies and the seriousness of allowing family member access to controlled files would argue for revocation. Patricia estimated the probability of favorable outcome at approximately 60%, better than even odds but far from certain, and she emphasized that the personal appearance hearing would be crucial in tipping the balance one direction or the other. The personal appearance hearing was scheduled for 3 months from the notification date, giving Maya substantial time to prepare but also extending the period of uncertainty and suspended professional status. Patricia outlined the preparation process, which would involve multiple practice sessions where Maya would be questioned about every aspect of her background, her security practices, the laptop incident, her relationship with Alexis, and her plans for preventing future vulnerabilities. The practice sessions would be deliberately adversarial, with Patricia and her associates role-playing skeptical adjudicators who would press hard on every weakness in Maya's case, forcing her to develop responses that were simultaneously honest and persuasive. The first practice session occurred 2 weeks later in Patricia's conference room, with Patricia playing the role of primary questioner and 2 of her junior associates serving as additional panel members. Maya sat alone on one side of a long table, facing 3 attorneys who had studied her case file thoroughly and prepared questions designed to expose inconsistencies or evasions in her account. The simulation felt uncomfortably real, activating Maya's stress response despite knowing that this was merely practice, and that these attorneys were ultimately working on her behalf. Patricia began with softball questions, allowing Maya to establish her service record and describe her career progression, building foundation before transitioning to more challenging territory. The tone shifted noticeably when Patricia asked Maya to explain exactly how controlled files had ended up on her personal laptop and why she had failed to delete them for 3 months. Maya provided the explanation she had developed in her written statement, acknowledging that she had been rushed and distracted, that she had made an error in downloading files to the wrong device, and that she had failed to immediately correct that error when interrupted by other demands. Patricia pressed harder, asking whether Maya understood that being rushed and distracted was not an excuse for security violations, that every service member faced competing demands and time pressure, and that the ability to maintain security discipline despite those pressures was precisely what security clearances were meant to assess. Maya agreed with this characterization and acknowledged that her handling of the situation had been inadequate regardless of the circumstances that contributed to the error. Patricia then asked what had changed about Maya's approach to security since the incident, what specific practices she had implemented to ensure similar failures would not occur in the future. Maya described enhanced procedures she had developed, including never working on both classified and unclassified systems during the same session, always completing security-related tasks before responding to interruptions, and maintaining a written checklist of security actions that needed to be verified before leaving her workspace. Patricia challenged whether these were meaningful changes or simply articulation of basic practices that Maya should have been following all along, pressing Maya to explain why adjudicators should believe her commitment to enhanced security was genuine, rather than merely convenient response to being caught in violation. The questioning continued for over 2 hours, with Patricia and her associates probing every vulnerable aspect of Maya's case, and forcing her to defend decisions and patterns that looked questionable when examined critically. They asked why Maya had given her sister a key to her townhouse despite Alexis's history of financial problems and poor judgment. They asked why Maya had continued to provide financial support to Alexis despite repeated disappointments and lack of genuine appreciation. They asked whether Maya's dedication to her career had blinded her to security risks created by her inattention to personal relationships and family dynamics. They asked whether someone who had made such serious errors in judgment about both security practices and family boundaries could be trusted with continued access to sensitive information and positions of special responsibility. Maya answered each question as honestly as she could while still presenting herself in the most favorable light possible, a balance that required constant calibration and awareness of how her words might be interpreted. She acknowledged mistakes while emphasizing lessons learned, accepted responsibility while providing context, demonstrated accountability while maintaining that she remained fundamentally trustworthy despite her failures. The exercise was exhausting and emotionally brutal, forcing Maya to defend herself against critiques that felt legitimate and damaging, confronting her with the reality that reasonable people examining her case might conclude she represented an unacceptable security risk, regardless of her prior service record or stated commitment to improvement. When the practice session finally concluded, Patricia provided feedback on Maya's performance, identifying areas where her responses had been effective and areas requiring refinement. Maya had done well in accepting responsibility without becoming defensive, in providing specific examples of changed practices rather than vague assurances, and in maintaining composure despite challenging questions. However, she needed to work on avoiding tendency to over-explain and provide excessive detail, which could make her appear anxious or evasive even when being truthful. She also needed to develop more compelling narrative about why adjudicators should trust her going forward, articulating what the experience had taught her about herself and her vulnerabilities in ways that demonstrated genuine growth, rather than superficial compliance with expectations. Over the following weeks, Maya participated in multiple additional practice sessions, each one forcing her to refine her responses and strengthen her ability to present her case persuasively under pressure. Between sessions, she worked with Patricia on assembling documentary evidence supporting her defense, gathering performance evaluations, letters of recommendation from supervisors and colleagues, awards and commendations, training certificates, and any other materials demonstrating her competence and reliability over 15 years of service. The package they compiled was substantial, creating visual representation of a career characterized by consistent excellence and recognition, providing counterweight to the single catastrophic incident that had triggered the investigation. Maya also worked on preparing character references who would testify on her behalf at the personal appearance hearing. Captain Torres had agreed to appear, and would speak to Maya's professional capabilities and his confidence in her continued reliability. Several colleagues from her operational assignments had volunteered to provide statements about working with her in high-pressure environments where security was paramount. Her former commanding officer from her first assignment after commissioning had written a detailed letter describing Maya as one of the most conscientious and security-conscious junior officers he had ever supervised. The accumulation of positive testimony created foundation for arguing that the laptop incident was truly aberrational, rather than reflective of Maya's actual approach to security obligations. During this preparation period, Maya also had to navigate the ongoing criminal case against Alexis. Despite her determination to maintain separation from her sister's legal troubles, she found herself drawn into the process because prosecutors wanted her testimony about the impact of Alexis's actions on her career and on national security operations. Maya met with an assistant United States attorney who explained that the government was offering Alexis a plea agreement involving probation and restitution rather than prison time, contingent on her cooperation with the investigation and acceptance of responsibility for her criminal conduct. The prosecutor wanted Maya to provide a victim impact statement that would be included in sentencing materials if Alexis accepted the plea offer. Writing the victim impact statement forced Maya to articulate the concrete costs of Alexis's betrayal in ways she had been avoiding through focus on legal proceedings and practical preparations. She had to acknowledge in writing that her sister's actions had destroyed her sense of security in her own home, had compromised her career and professional reputation, had cost her tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and had severed whatever remained of their family relationship. She had to describe living with uncertainty about whether she would be allowed to continue serving in the career she had built over 15 years, facing potential loss of professional identity and financial stability because of someone else's criminal choices. She had to explain that even if her clearances were ultimately restored, the incident would remain in her security file permanently, affecting every future clearance review and creating lasting vulnerability to questions about her judgment and reliability. The statement was honest but also strategic, emphasizing the severity of consequences to support the government's position that Alexis's conduct warranted meaningful punishment, despite the plea agreement. Maya felt complicated emotions about contributing to her sister's legal jeopardy, recognizing that the statement would likely influence the sentence Alexis received and potentially determine whether she faced incarceration or remained free on probation. But Maya also recognized that protecting Alexis from consequences had been her lifelong pattern, and that continuing that pattern would represent failure to internalize the lessons this experience should be teaching about boundaries and accountability. 3 weeks before the scheduled personal appearance hearing, Maya received unexpected communication from Alexis through her public defender. Alexis wanted to meet in person to apologize and attempt some form of reconciliation before the hearing occurred. Her attorney explained that Alexis had been attending counseling as part of her plea agreement conditions and had been working on taking responsibility for her actions rather than blaming others or minimizing the harm she had caused. The request placed Maya in a difficult position, forcing her to choose between her emotional need for continued separation from her sister and the possibility that refusing the meeting might appear vindictive or might foreclose any chance of eventual family reconciliation. Maya discussed the request with both Patricia Holloway and Dr. Chun, seeking perspective on whether meeting with Alexis would help or harm her security clearance case and her psychological well-being. Patricia's advice focused entirely on strategic considerations, noting that demonstrating willingness to engage with family members who had caused harm could be viewed as evidence of emotional maturity and stability, but that the meeting also created risks if Alexis said something during the encounter that undermined Maya's narrative about their relationship or her decision to sever contact. Dr. Chen's perspective was more nuanced, acknowledging that Maya had legitimate reasons for maintaining boundaries with her sister, but also suggesting that the meeting might provide closure or resolution that would benefit Maya's healing regardless of its impact on the legal proceedings. After several days of consideration, Maya agreed to a single meeting in a supervised setting with Alexis's attorney present. The meeting occurred at the public defender's office, in a small conference room that felt designed to contain emotional explosions while preventing physical contact. Alexis arrived looking diminished, having lost weight and acquired the particular kind of exhaustion that came from sustained stress and guilt. She sat across from Maya with her attorney beside her, and for several moments no one spoke as the sisters simply looked at each other across the distance created by betrayal and consequence. Alexis spoke first, her voice trembling but determined. She said she understood that apologies were inadequate, and that nothing she could say would undo the damage she had caused. She acknowledged that she had been thinking only of herself when she broke into Maya's computer, that she had rationalized her actions through self-pity and resentment, rather than considering the impact on her sister's life and career. She said that counseling had helped her recognize patterns of manipulation and entitlement that had characterized her relationship with Maya for their entire lives, patterns where she had taken advantage of Maya's sense of responsibility and guilt to extract support and assistance without offering genuine appreciation or reciprocity. She said she did not expect forgiveness and would understand if Maya never wanted contact with her again, but that she needed Maya to know that she finally understood what she had done and was genuinely sorry for the destruction she had caused. The apology was more thoughtful and seemingly genuine than anything Alexis had said during their phone conversation immediately after the breach. Maya recognized that her sister had clearly been coached by her attorney or counselor about what to say, but the words also seemed to reflect actual insight rather than purely strategic performance. She found herself feeling unexpected compassion for Alexis despite the anger and hurt that remained fresh and intense. Her sister was facing criminal conviction, would likely lose employment opportunities because of her record, and had destroyed her relationship with the only family member who had consistently supported her through decades of poor choices and self-created crises. Maya responded carefully, acknowledging that she appreciated Alexis's apology, but that words alone could not repair the damage or restore trust that had been comprehensively broken. She explained that she had spent months processing the betrayal and had concluded that their relationship had been fundamentally unhealthy for years, characterized by patterns where Maya's attempts to help had actually enabled Alexis's dysfunction, rather than promoting genuine growth or change. She said that she needed to maintain boundaries for her own well-being and professional survival, that she could not continue in the caretaker role she had assumed since their mother's death, and that Alexis would need to build a life without depending on Maya's intervention or support. Alexis accepted this with visible pain but without argument or pleading, suggesting that she understood the finality of Maya's position and recognized that pushing back would only confirm the patterns Maya was describing. She asked only that Maya would consider the possibility of limited contact in the future once sufficient time had passed and Alexis had demonstrated through sustained changed behavior that she was addressing the issues that had led to her criminal conduct. Maya agreed to this possibility without making any commitment about timeline or circumstances, leaving the door open without creating expectations that might perpetuate unhealthy dynamics. The meeting concluded after less than 30 minutes, both sisters emotionally drained but also appearing slightly less burdened than when they had entered the room. Maya left feeling that the encounter had provided some measure of closure, allowing her to see Alexis as a flawed human being struggling with problems she had largely created, rather than simply as the betrayer who had destroyed Maya's career. The compassion did not eliminate Maya's anger or change her decision about maintaining boundaries, but it allowed her to hold both accountability and understanding simultaneously, recognizing that people could cause terrible harm while still deserving some measure of human empathy. The final 2 weeks before the personal appearance hearing involved intensive preparation with Patricia Holloway and her team, refining every aspect of Maya's presentation and responses to anticipated questions. They reviewed her written statement multiple times, strengthening language and ensuring consistency with her verbal explanations. They conducted additional practice sessions with outside attorneys brought in to provide fresh perspectives and novel challenging questions. They prepared visual materials including timeline documents, organizational charts, and summary presentations that would help adjudicators understand Maya's service record and the context of the security breach. The preparation was thorough and exhausting, leaving Maya feeling simultaneously as ready as she could be and terrified that her preparation would prove inadequate when facing the actual adjudication panel. The night before the hearing, Maya sat alone in her townhouse trying to achieve some form of mental calm that would allow her to sleep and perform effectively the following day. She had followed all of Dr. Chen's recommendations about stress management, had maintained her exercise routine, had practiced mindfulness techniques that still felt foreign and awkward, had reached out to the limited support network she possessed for encouragement and perspective. But ultimately she faced the hearing alone, her fate to be determined by strangers who would assess her worthiness based on files and testimony, and their professional judgment about whether she represented acceptable security risk. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point, from the shock of discovering Alexis in her office to the grinding months of investigation and preparation. She had learned things about herself during this period that she might have preferred not to know, confronted failures and vulnerabilities she had successfully ignored during years of professional achievement. She had been forced to acknowledge that her approach to life had been unbalanced and unsustainable, that her identity had been dangerously merged with her career in ways that created both professional vulnerability and personal impoverishment. She had begun developing aspects of herself that existed independently of her military service, creating foundations that would provide some stability regardless of the hearing outcome. The growth felt genuine but insufficient, changes that would require years to fully integrate, and that could be easily overwhelmed if her career collapsed, and she lost the structure and purpose that had organized her adult life. She wanted to believe that she had become stronger and more resilient through this experience, that suffering had produced wisdom, and that crisis had catalyzed necessary transformation. But she also recognized the possibility that she was simply creating comfortable narratives to make bearable a situation that remained fundamentally threatening and unresolved. Maya eventually fell asleep after midnight, her dreams fragmented and anxious, filled with images of interrogation rooms and judgment and loss. She woke before her alarm with adrenaline already flooding her system, her body preparing for confrontation even as her mind tried to maintain calm and focus. She went through her morning routine with mechanical precision, dressing in her service uniform with extra attention to details that would communicate professionalism and respect for the proceedings. She ate breakfast despite having no appetite, recognizing that her body would need fuel regardless of her nervous system's insistence that eating was impossible. Patricia Holloway picked her up at 7:30 for the drive to the adjudication facility in suburban Maryland. They reviewed key points during the drive, Patricia offering final coaching and reassurance, while maintaining realistic assessment of the challenges Maya would face. The hearing would likely last several hours, with multiple panel members asking questions and reviewing evidence, and Maya would need to maintain focus and composure throughout despite the physical and emotional toll of sustained scrutiny. Patricia reminded her to pause before answering questions, to take time to formulate clear responses rather than rushing to fill silence, and to remember that appearing thoughtful and measured was more important than demonstrating quick reactions. The adjudication facility was a nondescript government building indistinguishable from the thousands of other office complexes that housed the administrative machinery of federal bureaucracy. Maya and Patricia checked in at security, surrendered their electronic devices, and were escorted to a waiting area outside the hearing room. Other cases were being heard throughout the building, other individuals facing their own professional reckonings, other lives suspended in bureaucratic processes that would determine their futures according to standards and considerations they could only partially understand or influence. When they were finally called into the hearing room, Maya felt her heart rate spike and her palms begin to sweat despite her deliberate breathing and mental preparation. The room was smaller than she had expected, with a long table where 3 adjudicators sat reviewing documents and a single chair facing them where Maya would sit during questioning. Patricia took a seat along the wall where she could observe but not participate, leaving Maya to face the panel alone as required by the hearing procedures. The adjudicators introduced themselves with titles and credentials that Maya immediately forgot, her attention consumed by trying to read their expressions and assess whether they appeared hostile, sympathetic, or simply neutral professionals executing their assigned duties. The lead adjudicator, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and the weary expression of someone who had conducted hundreds of these hearings, began by explaining the process and asking Maya to confirm that she understood her rights and the purpose of the proceeding. Maya's voice was steady when she responded in the affirmative, her military training suppressing the terror that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for coherent speech. The adjudicator then invited Maya to make an opening statement if she wished, an opportunity Patricia had prepared her for extensively. Maya took a slow breath and began speaking, presenting the narrative she and Patricia had crafted about her service record, the laptop incident, what she had learned from the experience, and why she believed she remained trustworthy despite her failures. Her voice gained strength as she spoke, finding rhythm in the prepared material, while still maintaining genuine emotion and conviction. She acknowledged her mistakes without caveat or excuse, described specific changes in her security practices and self-awareness, and expressed commitment to continued service if given the opportunity to demonstrate that the incident was truly uncharacteristic of her actual approach to security obligations. She concluded by thanking the panel for their time and consideration, then waited for the questioning that would determine whether 15 years of dedication and sacrifice would be enough to overcome a single catastrophic failure of judgment and discipline. The lead adjudicator thanked Maya for her opening statement and opened a folder containing what appeared to be extensive notes and documentation related to her case. The woman's expression remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing about whether Maya's prepared remarks had resonated or fallen flat. She began with questions that seemed designed to establish baseline facts, asking Maya to confirm details about her service history, her current assignment, and the circumstances that had led to her early return from the deployment in Eastern Europe. Maya answered each question concisely, providing the information requested without elaborating unnecessarily. Following Patricia Holloway's guidance about maintaining control over the narrative by not volunteering material beyond what was directly asked, the questioning shifted to the security breach itself, and the lead adjudicator asked Maya to walk through exactly what had happened on the day she discovered her sister in her home office. Maya had rehearsed this account dozens of times during preparation sessions, and she delivered it now with careful attention to accuracy and completeness. She described arriving home unexpectedly, finding the alarm disarmed and signs of occupation, discovering Alexis at her laptop with files spread across the desk, and the conversation that had followed. She acknowledged her immediate recognition that controlled files had been compromised, and her understanding that she bore responsibility for creating the vulnerability through her earlier failure to properly secure those materials. The second adjudicator, a man in his early 40s with the precise demeanor of someone with technical background, asked Maya to explain in detail the circumstances under which the controlled files had been downloaded to her personal laptop. Maya provided the explanation she had refined through multiple iterations, describing the administrative report she had been preparing, the need to reference operational data, and her error in downloading files to the wrong device while working under time pressure with multiple competing demands. She acknowledged that the error should have been immediately corrected regardless of interruptions or other priorities, and that her failure to delete the files represented exactly the kind of security consciousness lapse that clearances were meant to prevent. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.